So I found myself in the West, where I suddenly was exposed to so much opportunity and possibility and a sense of freedom that people back home will never even be able to understand.
Freedom of speech goes back to the central value of Western civilization, I think, which is the sanctity of the individual.
I have my views and I'm trying to voice them, and I thought that this was a free society in which you could do that, and then boom, label, branded. Done.
What does bring me hope is that there are some brilliant minds who really care about what's going on in the West and are prepared to fight for it.
Well, we're sitting here at ARC and we wanted to talk about Western values. Africa, you, I think, have a very interesting understanding of what that is, like me being an outsider somewhat, growing up in Zimbabwe. So why don't you kick us off?
So for context, in terms of my story, I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. I'm 31. And I came to the UK when I was 9 years old. And for me, it is a young age, but it's still old enough for me to remember what we were leaving behind. And this was 2001, leaving Zimbabwe when it was rapidly declining economically. It used to be a thriving, beautiful country. It was a country where people from the UK would go to Zimbabwe to go on holiday or send their children to be educated in Zimbabwe because the education system was very, very good. We had to leave because we had no choice. There wasn't such a thing as freedom of expression from, let's say, the early 2000s. It was not a democratic country at all. We had the same party in power for decades. Corruption is everywhere. It's unavoidable. You have to bribe the police if you want anything to be done. You have to bribe government officials if you want anything to be done, including setting up your own business. So there are so many things that I was too young to even understand until I came to this country, until I started to get older, until I started to realize what my mother was running away from. And I would say that for me, one of the biggest things has always been freedom of expression. Because I am from a country where if you say anything out of turn, you and your entire family will be punished for it. You can even be imprisoned if you criticize the president. So I think my contribution to this conversation is going to be from that perspective of someone that was born and raised in a country that was just crumbling and continues to, and found myself in the West, where I suddenly was exposed to so much opportunity and possibility and a sense of freedom that people back home will never even be able to understand. Yeah.
It's something I've always tried to communicate to people in the West, and I think you've actually touched on two things there. Well, three things. First of all, I'd love to be able to bribe the police to do their job in this country. That'd be nice. But the two things you touched on, one of them I think is Western values, and the other one is Western realities.
Yes.
Which Western values produce. So the stability, the lack of corruption, all of these things. Not so much about values, they're the product of Western values, and those are the realities of life in the West. Yeah. But the value, I think you touched on freedom of speech. I'd be interested to dig deeper into that, because I think freedom of speech goes back to the central value of Western civilization, I think, which is the sanctity of the individual. The idea that you as an individual have worth and value in a way that in Russia, for example, or in China, you absolutely do not. You are, you see it with the war in Ukraine, but the Russian way of doing war is you send men into battle underprepared in wave attacks, and it doesn't matter how many of them die, it doesn't matter how many of them freeze to death, it doesn't matter how many of them starve, which is what's happened, because they're not worth anything. And in fact, in Russian mythology, I don't mean like myths, but the culture, the sacrifice of the ordinary person for the leader is a good thing. It's to be revered, right? It's to be emulated. It's to be repeated. So I think the reason we treasure freedom of expression in the West is actually that we believe the individual is sacrosanct in and of him or herself in a way that many other cultures do not. I mean, China would be the same.
So I would say that comes from the sovereignty of the individual comes from the Christian foundations of the West. So my immediate response to you is, well, Russia was built on Christianity. Also, that's the foundation of Russia. But Russia is distinct from the West and doesn't have that sovereignty. Why have Russia gone a different path to the West?
because I think you've begged the question by saying it's a product of Christianity. I think there are different forms of Christianity, obviously, and Russia is Orthodox. In the Russian system, the church is an instrument of government. I mean, the current head of the Russian church is a KGB agent, right? So, and Putin uses him to control the populace, essentially. So I think you've kind of got it the other way around there. And I think the Orthodox worldview is slightly different to the Western, Protestant or Anglican or whatever worldview as well. I think there's a difference.
I think is one way of approaching this question is working out what we're not, what Western values are not, because technically, communism is a Western value. Marx was Western. Nazism is a Western values, obviously, from Germany, fascism from Italy. Those are all technically Western values. So what are we exactly exploring? It's not just Western values, it's the Western values that we actually want to treasure and carry forward. And I guess in contrast to that, what are those?
I was asked this question when I was studying law, legal philosophy, and I had a great professor. His name is Professor Kisin, and he asked our class. He was like, "Guys, we're always talking about Western values, and especially in modern universities. I don't know if you've noticed this yourself, but we're always presented with what I would say a false dichotomy between you're either a universalist or you're a cultural relativist." And that was, you had to pick either one of those sides. And in reality, to me, that always translated into, we're going to call Western values universal, or we're going to say, well, cultural relativism, there is no hierarchy between cultures. But in practice, most of the professors that I met who were cultural relativists would, in fact, say that Western values are below any other, value system. But I think being from the West and seeing the beauty, the good, and the truth that is deeply embedded into our culture, I think we should stand up for it, because we are on the brink of losing it, aren't we? But so the question was asked, he's like, so what are Western values? And I noticed that most people couldn't really name any of them, apart from maybe freedom and equality. And then freedom in the sense that we've heard about, today, Bishop Barron spoke about basically freedom without any sense of responsibility. So basically just a neoliberal or liberal approach, do whatever the hell you want, and equality being the idea that we are all equal, there are no differences between us, whether we're a man or a female, or, it's just, which ultimately, you get really close to Marxism there if you take the route of consequences equality. So the question, what are Western values? I think it's important that we talk about, and you mentioned the sanctity of life, and then you mean
sanctity of the individual.
Of the individual.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the individual, and I would say then in that case, life, because every individual is alive. And you said, well, that's an inherently Christian value, and I agree with you. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be interesting maybe to have a bit of a discussion about, what do we consider to be Western values, and is that inherently Christian? I would say yes, but maybe you guys don't agree. I don't know.
No, I don't think I would disagree. What I think is interesting in what you said, though, is the idea that either we have to be Western supremacists or we have to be cultural relativists. This also seems like a false dichotomy to me. My take on it has always been that Western values are the best values for Western people. I don't know that Western values, for example, are the best way to run Russia.
No, I agree with you there.
You see what I mean?
Absolutely, but that's what I meant more so with the universalist.
Yeah.
Because when people say, "Oh, I'm a universalist," they go ahead and they list all of these values that I would say are Western that don't necessarily work well in other parts of the world, and then you get the American idea of let's export democracy.
What are some of those, for example, the ones that you think don't work as well if we try and apply them elsewhere?
Well, I mean, when we talk about the idea of exporting democracy, so to say, for example, I think we've seen quite, good, strong evidence that doesn't really work that well. And, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what makes a people or a nation, open or susceptible to democratic thinking? And maybe we could even consider or think about whether the West thrives so well with democracy, if it is surviving in the way that we would like to see it survive. But But yeah, I mean, where you started, the sanctity of the individual is a really good place to start, because that's one that I think we now more so, especially in the legal system, see as a universal value, as universal human rights, which I think is a contradiction in terminus. Is that really so? Maybe in the West, I guess, but maybe not elsewhere.
Something that stood out from what you said was, and I really admire people that were born and raised in the West that actually understand. And I rarely use the word privilege, but I'm going to use it very intentionally in this context, that actually understand that the privilege they have to be born in the Western world. Because I often wonder if people just really don't think about Western values, because it's just something that's always been afforded to them, whether that's freedom of expression, free market capitalism, for example, that if you have an idea and you decide to start a business, I could do it right now. I could do it tomorrow. And I don't have to worry about the government being overly involved in any way. I don't have to worry that I will need to bribe someone in order for my business to thrive. There's just so many things that we don't even consider at all. Even things like scientific thinking, which I think, right, is a Western value, right? That you get to look at things through logic and reason and actually testing instead of just taking them or being forced to take them as they are. I think it's a mass of people just taking for granted something that they've always had. They don't know any different. Yeah. Which is why I think for someone like me, someone who's expected to, let's say, fall very neatly into what is considered the left, that I'm supposed to think in a certain way. I'm supposed to think that white supremacy is oppressing me. I'm supposed to walk around feeling like I'm marginalized. These are all of the things that I'm told. But because of my historical context, I know what I didn't have before, and I know what a lot of people in my family right now in real time absolutely don't have. But someone who's born and raised in this country, they don't know any different. So I often think just about the concept of Western values in that sense, that a lot of people don't have anything to compare it to.
One of the things that you're raising in my mind is, Winston, I don't know if you remember, we were at a small dinner with Jordan Peterson, and I asked him what Western values were. Right. I don't know if you remember this. And what he was saying, very interesting, because what you made me think about is partly it's about the idea that power should be devolved from the... I mean, in Russia, not the case. Power should be concentrated at the top. And some people would argue that's what it takes to run Russia well. You have to have a strong leader at the top, because 300 years ago, it would take months for a delegation from Moscow, a letter from Moscow to travel to the Far East. And so unless you had a strong leader that everybody feared so much, you simply couldn't keep the country together. But in the West, we seem to believe, you talk about democracy, in the idea that power should sort of be diffused down towards us. And what he was talking about, Jordan, and what he said was that if you look at chimp tribes, whatever they're called, the alpha male is often not the biggest one. In fact, it's often the smallest or one of the smaller males. And the reason is that instead of ruling with a fist, with an iron fist, which is a very bad long-term strategy, because the moment you show weakness, you're going to be torn apart by others, either a bigger, stronger male or a couple of them who team up together and then fight it out between themselves afterwards. It's about building coalitions of mutual reciprocation and trade. And I translated Alexander Dugin's Foundations of Geopolitics book from my Substack a while ago. And this is one of the things he talked about, how the Atlantic civilizations, Britain and America, they're civilizations of the sea, so they're based on trading and commerce and so on, and naturally tend towards liberalism and trade, whereas civilizations like Russia and China are civilizations of the land that are naturally autocratic and tend toward dictatorship and militarism because of the way that they do things. And therefore power in our sort of civilization goes down to the people as much as possible, whereas in those it accumulates at the top. And that certainly seems to be the case when we look at the world today.
Yeah, well, and even outside of democracy, if you look at more, European history and aristocratic state forms, it was still the case, So talking about the European tradition, I would always say, well, it's it's Jerusalem and it's Athens, right? It's antiquity and then it's Christianity. And if you look at the way that Plato speaks about the different state forms, democracy is actually the closest to tyranny that you can get. And the highest state form is an aristocracy. But it's not what we now in our modern minds attribute to the idea of like, a ruler with an iron fist. No, we think he talks about the philosopher king, right? And I feel like that's, and Jesus himself being king, but definitely not one to rule with violence or fear, so that in the European tradition, even before we became democratic nations, the main way of ruling or how our civilization survived and grew to the heights that it did was never, or not for longer periods of time at least, through that type of fear that we maybe see in other parts of the world.
There's a reason the Magna Carta happens here in Russia.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, yeah, but that's important to note, because people are terrified of saying that. And I feel like a lot of, especially Westerners, don't come from the outside, but who grow up here. And right, exactly as you say, almost like fish who swim in the water don't realize that they're swimming in the water, right? They don't realize that. And they think back of our history. And obviously we're also being told that our history was terrible and we're, evil colonizers and women were suppressed beyond belief. And I think those are all false notions of what our history was like, even before we became democratic nations. I don't think, and that's what sets the West apart. And having people who are not aware of the historical nuances, or of something like the Magna Carta, that's dangerous, because now we're losing it. People don't see it as an inherently Western privilege or, a consequence of Western values or of our Christian foundation. And if you're like, well, no, that's all random, then yeah, you're gonna lose it. And I think that's exactly the path that we're on right now.
Well, I mean, what is that line that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance? And I think the price of prosperity is eternal vigilance, and the price of safety is eternal vigilance. The price of strength is eternal. I mean, all of these things, once you start to take them for granted, which is what you're really talking about, right? This is why, I mean, I always say about myself, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Africa, I've made a career of saying some incredibly obvious things that everybody knows, and everyone freaks out. You know what I mean? And the incredibly obvious thing to say is, the reason we are where we are is not an accident. And the moment we start tinkering with it, assuming that all the good things will remain as they are, that's when we start to pull away at the threads of the sweater. And before you know it, there's not much of a sweater left.
Well, this is a question I wanted to ask you guys, is that, and it's been apparent again this month, but it was also apparent we saw in 2020 when BLM, which was explicitly anti-Western, on their website, it was basically a list of values that were the antithesis of what I think Western values are. Anti-nuclear family, explicitly Marxist, and it enjoyed...
Anti-capitalist.
It enjoyed complete widespread support in our generation and younger. And it seems not only is that support, there's widespread desire to bring down the system. We saw this across America with ongoing riots. And so this anti-Western thing it's really deep amongst us. And how we've got there, that's one question. But how we get out of there, that's another one I want to ask you guys. Is it so widespread that we can't get out of it, or do you think that there's hope that we can persuade our peers that there's something here worth clinging on to?
How we got here is an interesting question. I think we sort of answered it earlier when you were talking about people taking things for granted. I think that's part of it. I've always found it interesting that very, 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 very few families are able to pass down wealth and power over successive generations. And we are deeply suspicious of families that do. I mean, the Rothschilds are sort of at the top of every conspiracy you can find, because they've been able to maintain that power and wealth over centuries. And it's actually very difficult. And it's very difficult. I mean, I'm thinking about this all the time with my son, because I'm fortunate enough that I'm doing well, and I hope to do even better. And every extra pound that I earn and every extra bit of success I have is a disincentive for him. But by the very nature of the process, it's corrupting and erosive for him to grow up in wealth and comfort, right? So growing up in wealth and comfort is a problem if you want to raise resilient, ambitious, driven people. It's hard. I can't remember this. I think it was Jack Dempsey or some boxer who explained why once you become a boxing champion, it's very difficult to maintain, because it says it's hard to wake up at 6 a.m. when you sleep on silk sheets. And we are a society that sleeps historically.
So does that mean we need to lose a bit of what our values, lose those before we get them back?
I wonder,
So how much worse will it get?
Well, you've asked me in the wrong week, mate. No one wants to hear what I have to say about that.
Maybe we're a little bit too comfortable, that people are a little bit too...
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's exactly what I'm saying. So it's very difficult to maintain those values if they're not... And the other problem is, I mean, we all know this, is it's easier to maintain if you are really determined to inculcate the correct values in your children. I would hope that I'll find a way with my children to raise them in a way that they are resilient, they are driven, they are ambitious, etc. I hope so. But if your education system is doing the opposite of that, what you're talking about, which is undermining the very things that made us who we are,
right,
then you've got a problem. Then you've got a really big problem. And I think of all the places all of this stuff is bad, it is the worst in education and academia. By far. I think in the media, we're kind of starting to make inroads. We're winning on some issues, particularly in the new media. I think new media is very much on our side, actually. But there are lots of other fields where it's sort of ambivalent. And then in education, I mean, it's bad.
Well, it's hard, right? Because the return of ethics, when we're talking about values, morality, it's the narrow path, it's the long road, it's not something that happens overnight, but it's broken down relatively quickly. And we live in a society now that says, well, the idea of a norm in and of itself is oppressive.
Yes.
Because if we have a norm, then obviously some people are going to exceed the norm, they're going to do better, and some people are going to fall below it. And then if you say, well, that's inequality, and we need to establish full and total equality, the fastest way to make everyone equal is to just break everyone down. And then, just like communism, as we know, you're never truly equal. Everyone's just equally poor and miserable, and there are few at the top that are super rich and well off. People have oftentimes avoid making moral statements or making moral arguments, and they go for utilitarian arguments or scientific arguments saying, well, it doesn't work. For example, this is something that was really important to me during COVID, when governments all over were talking about vaccine mandates, or you couldn't go to restaurants, etc., if you weren't vaccinated. One of the main arguments that you'd hear people use in order to criticize it was, well, the vaccine doesn't work. It doesn't stop transmission, so it doesn't make any sense to make policies based on, whether or not you are vaccinated. But that argument doesn't suffice. I think you need to really think about, well, do we think it is morally right for a government to say this and this and this you need to do in order to take part in society? What type of value is behind that? It's agency. It is indeed the sanctity of the individual. It is free will. Where does that come from? Why do we have that? Why do we even have privacy? If you don't know, then you are left with, the vaccine doesn't stop against transmission, so we can't have these policies. And the next time around, a vaccine's created that does stop against transmission. And then what's your argument? So you stand empty-handed. And so the return of ethics, I don't know how we're going to do it, because it's a longer road. It's harder to do. But I think it's the only way forward if you want to take a stance against what ultimately will become tyranny. And tyranny cloaked in, under the guise of equality or convenience, which we see a lot in the Western world now. People who accept all sorts of liberty infringements under the idea that it's going to make their life easier or safer. Right. You're not going to cancel, or you're not going to counter that with just utility arguments. You need moral stances.
Well, the idea of non-judgment is a very, very destructive idea because it prevents you from saying that something is better than something else.
Absolutely.
Morally.
Mm.
And so when we introduce the notion of non-judgment in order to, include people and not be discriminatory and all of this, when you take that to its logical conclusion, you end up with this place where you cannot make moral normative statements about anything.
Yes.
Because a normative statement is by itself telling other people how to live their life. And we're liberal. I'm not on the right, actually, but I'm very troubled by this way of thinking.
Yeah.
I got snapped out of my own trance maybe 5 years ago when I started to realize that actually people expected me to think and speak and feel in a specific way because I'm Black, or because my supposed values align with the left. So I'm apparently left-wing. I'd never thought of myself as any sort of party or side or position. And I still find it strange to this day when people try and associate a decision that I make or a way of being that I am to some kind of political party or stance.
Well, maybe that's part of what it is actually to be West, because you could definitely make a Western, because you can definitely make the case that both the Labour movement and the Conservative movement, say in Britain, have its roots in Christianity. Certainly the Labour movement came out of a Catholic socialist movement in early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. But so maybe that that is the sort of synthesis is where you're at, which is actually the more natural place. And it's that there's an awkward synthesis of ideas from the left of equality and from the right of responsibility, and that's where we get to that sometimes uncomfortable mix, which is perhaps unique to the West, where it's not necessarily elsewhere.
Yeah, because even when I think of back home in Zimbabwe right now, you are forced to pick. You have to pick between ZANU-PF or MDC. You have to choose. So I think there is something about the fact that actually I'm in a country where I'm not forced at every turn. It happens in social circles. It doesn't happen so much anymore because I do allow myself to exist between the left and the right, and just whoever's making most sense. That's how I view the world.
I've been to your house and you have Thomas Sowell on the bookshelf, which I tell you, left-wingers don't have Thomas Sowell.
Do you know what? Well, I was just going to say, Thomas Sowell he's
brilliant.
His books, if you can get somebody to read them, that's like the biggest red pill you get. You should just crush them into people's water.
Absolutely.
So what you're saying is, I mean, even if you don't want, to pick, people will pick for you or just get branded or labeled. Because that was my experience. I, funnily enough, my sort of road to the political realm started quite young, when I was about 13, and I watched a movie together with my parents about Boris Deary. She's a woman from Somalia who was subjected to female genital mutilation. And the movie, it's her book, and they made a movie out of it, and it details her life story. And she fled to the UK and then was discovered as a model, and she became like a top model. It's a really inspiring story. And then later, she started advocating against female genital mutilation at the UN even. And I remember watching that movie and as a 13-year-old and seeing her on screen, also as a 13-year-old, fleeing because she was forced to get married to her uncle. And she's like, so she left and she made it to the UK. And I thought to myself, I was like, why is it so that I don't have to endure that as a 13-year-old in the Netherlands? Why that doesn't happen to me? I don't have to marry my uncle who's 50 plus. That sort of sparked something in me where I was like, okay, not in all parts of the world are women treated the same way. And it made me aware of those cultural differences. And I thought back then, naive me, that made me a feminist. So if you want to fight for the rights of women and you don't want them to be subjected to genital mutilation, then you are a feminist. So I joined feminist groups when I was a teenager and quickly found out that a white woman with blue eyes and blonde hair is not allowed to talk about female genital mutilation in the Islamic world because that's their culture, and you, little blonde girl have no right to think anything of that. And that was, I was so disillusioned by that. I was like, whoa, what's happening here? And later in life, same thing. Standing up for the things that I believed in, that's far right. That's extremist. And I don't, we were joking about my hair color and my eye color, but like it gets brought into the equation often, when I started voicing my opinions about immigration, for example, the first thing that one of the major newspapers, sort of our equivalent of The Guardian, wrote about me was, well, it's unsurprising considering the way she looks. It's like as if my hair color and my eye color have something to do with my political views. It was like, so I actually know what that's like in a way. And it's very disappointing. And now I've run with it. I even have a shield maiden of the far right in my bio now because that's what they called me. But at first I was quite terrified by that. I was like, what do you mean I'm far right? I have my views and I'm trying to voice them. And I thought that this was a free society in which you could do that. And then, boom, label, branded, done, Yeah.
We see that there's a very common phenomenon of the time. I've had a similar experience. I mean, I was brought up canvassing for the Lib Dems, and then suddenly I read the wrong book and I'm far right when, no, actually, I'm in this weird place in the middle. I think a lot of people at this conference they're sort of politically homeless, not quite comfortable with either of those labels, and like Africa, I'm still not quite comfortable to take on any, because none of them are quite right.
Well, my line on this is I'm politically non-binary, and it's kind of how I feel. But now you see, back to what you were talking about when people go, you're this, and what you're talking about, far right or whatever. It's interesting that a new word has now come about, which is coded. They now say, well, this is coded as right wing, or this codes as right wing. And it's just a way of basically saying that certain issues make you right wing, which I find very interesting. For example, you mentioned immigration. I'm an immigrant to this country. I believe in strong border controls. I believe there should be no illegal immigration. I believe immigration should be chosen by the people of the country and beneficial to the people of the country, right? That is not a controversial view even among immigrants. And it used to be an extraordinarily uncontroversial view on the left, because the left used to care about workers, and it's very difficult to care about workers if you import lots of competition for those workers. So the whole thing has become, we all know this, but the left has changed very fundamentally, and it leaves people like the three of us, certainly, I don't know whether it's true of you ever, in this weird limbo that we're all in. And I really struggle with it, because I think on the one hand, I'm naturally very disagreeable and I hate tribes in general. But on the other hand, when you want to do things, one man, one woman is not really enough.
Yeah, you need some culture, and that's what a culture is. You need some people to agree on a decent amount in order to act in cohesion together. So you need tribe to a certain extent.
Yes, and then that tribe has to have a political expression. Which in a two-party system, I don't know what the case is in Holland. So
very much not two-party.
No, not two-party. And is that better? Does that make it easier to get your views through and implemented? No,
it's funny actually, because we our last elections, I think we had 36 parties that were. I think we have 12 now in our current parliament, and. I would say no, because most of them actually, when you look at their views, there's so much overlap. And then there's the illusion of choice. There's the illusion that they are different, or if you vote for that person, it's going to be just slightly different. But then they form a coalition, and most of the differences that they had go out of the window anyway. But, I've noticed this often talking, especially to Americans or here in the UK. People are like, oh, it's so much more democratic. You have so much more choice. Like, yeah, no, you end up with people who actually are very much aligned, and then the parties that are considered more right-wing are almost always automatically excluded from the coalition formation. And, the reason why I ran with the label that they put on me, like the shield maiden of the far right, is not because I necessarily identify as far right, but I stand for the views that I have. And if that lands me a label like that, I know that will happen to other people. And I know that the aim that the people who called me that had was to scare me into obedience and silence. And if I stop caring about being called far right, then maybe other people will be like, oh, okay, well, then I don't have to be as afraid either. And that's sort of the reason why I'm like, I'm fine with it. I'm like, okay, you want to call me that?
Are you not concerned at all about the elements or the far right, or to whatever degree, that you actually you don't agree with, you don't like, that you would be lumped in with those people?
Oh, yeah, but the funny thing is that those people make it very clear that they don't like me. And I only,
Because you're a woman?
Yeah, that happens.
Or for other reasons?
No, for sure. I mean, or people who think that I don't go far enough, and then you get your controlled opposition and things like that.
Anyone who uses the phrase control opposition has a brainworm.
Well, there are oftentimes people who don't have any skin in the game, and who are just, perpetually online and anonymous on the internet. And I think it's an easy way. But yeah, so I'm like, I feel like I can't win anyway. So I just go with what I think is right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we all experience. And the reason why I admire both of you, Winston and Konstantin specifically.
Not you, Evans.
It's fine.
I've been excluded of that one.
It's fine.
It's because you're a woman.
Yeah, because I'm a woman.
Yeah. Personally. And what I admire, and you both really helped me, especially as I was kind of unraveling my own awakening and starting to ask more questions. When you truly accept that you're going to be misunderstood regardless, I think that's when you do your best work.
Yeah.
I really do. And for me, I actually admire everything you're sharing around kind of owning that label and still kind of staying very convicted in your values and what you believe to be true. And the approach that I've realized sort of works for me, and this might be useful to anyone else listening to this, is that I accept that that's probably part of the territory of actually speaking out loud and owning your values, but also being open to having your mind changed where you need to, having that intellectual humility. Just to close, are you hopeful? When it comes to just these conversations in general, I think a lot of people understandably are very cynical. They think, there is no way out of this.
Unfortunately, there's not really a short answer to that.
What's the intuitive answer?
I'm pretty pessimistic at the moment, but maybe that's because it's this month particularly. But on the other hand, we're here at ARC, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in the world, yourselves included, and even before we started speaking to each other, just seeing the faces gave me hope. And so what does bring me hope is that there are some brilliant minds who really care about what's going on in the West and are prepared to fight for it and not just running away. So maybe I won't go into the pessimism, but that's the sort of bit of hope for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, even if I have my black pill moments, right? But the question of whether or not we should do something doesn't change no matter how pessimistic I am. It's like, yeah, maybe the odds aren't good, but that doesn't mean that we should just stop trying. If you don't try, then you're going to lose anyway. So you just, even if the odds look bad, just soldier on.
I think I'm very much in your place, which is, how can I say this delicately? The problems that you're talking about that we've talked about this privately, the problems we've seen over the last few weeks, I'm afraid, I think are not going to get better. Structurally, I don't see a way they get better. Unless something really major changes and major things have happened. I mean, if you think, we just had Neil Ferguson, the historian, on trigonometry, and he was saying, well, if you think about 1973, which is the last time Israel was invaded, if you think about where the West was at that time, where Britain was at that time, it was really, really bad place. We were in a bad place, and then we bounced back. So I think anything is possible. I think right now I am enthused by the fact that people like us are getting together and talking. There's been enough talking. We have to start building things. The time for talking is kind of over. There's not much more. We all know what the problem is. We've all done the podcast and we all understand it's time to build alternative media. It's time to build alternative education. It's time to start to seriously reshape politics. Because I think what you're talking about, Eva, is people's frustration with democracy is that it fundamentally isn't reflective of the values of most people. I mean, the example I give about this is in the last 2 weeks, we've seen polling which shows that 92% of Conservative voters in the UK and 70% of Labour voters, 70% of left-wing Labour voters in the UK support deporting people who glorify terrorism. But we all know it's not going to happen. That is not a structure democratically that's sustainable, right? If the majority of the public want something, and this is true on many other issues, and it's not going to happen, and we all know it's not going to happen even sitting here right now, we've got a problem. So I think the time for talking is kind of running out. I think it's time for doing things. And then the approach you gave is correct, which is you have to do your best and see what happens, see where the chips fall.